Good afternoon. All right, so I'm the lead off for the main event, what I consider the main event. This is Mr. Frazier. So, all right, so we're going to shift now to our focus to Alabama, and I'll begin with providing a very brief background for Alabama troops and their experiences immediately prior to their service in France. So territorial and state militia served in all the wars from the War of 1812 through the Spanish-American War. Only in 1903 was the designation Alabama National Guard used, at which time the State's Guard consisted of these units that you see listed on the slide. The 3rd Infantry Regiment was mustered out actually in 1912. And so the Alabama National Guard again then had 3 infantry regiments associated with it. In this early period, training consisted primarily of drills and then encampments in partnership with regular Army troops. And this photograph on this slide is actually from a camp in 1914. In the years prior to 1916, the Alabama National Guard amassed a respectable record in performing duties when called upon for protecting prisoners, primarily from lynch mobs, to police striking workers, and again, primarily in the coal and iron industries in Alabama, and assisting after natural disasters. That would be with hurricanes and floods primarily. In the early 20th century, several pieces of federal legislation bracketed by the Militia or DIC Act of 1903 and the National Defense Act of 1916 worked to modernize and professionalize the National Guards of the various states. Records from this early period indicate clearly that the Alabama National Guard benefited from the increasingly rigorous expectations of the military. Slowly, the National Guard became more professional with less of a club mentality, and they began making progress toward meeting the standards of the Army. In 1916, in response to the incursions into New Mexico by Francisco Pancho Villa, President Woodrow Wilson federalized the National Guard, and Alabama Guardsmen joined others from across the nation for about a 4-month period in what was known as Mexican Border Service. Mexican Border Service was intended to use the nation's National Guards to help protect the southwestern border against further raids from northern Mexico. This comprehensive federalization of the Alabama National Guard provided a test of the progress that the Guard had been making since the 1903 and subsequent reforms. And these photographs are obviously from the mobilization of the Guard from Birmingham. As it turned out, the true benefit of Mexican Border Service was not in dealing with Mexican concerns, but rather in providing extended experience of military life. This experience proved valuable once the United States entered World War I. This section of it, I was going to provide this brief background for U.S. entry into World War I, but Dr. Seifert has already done such an excellent job of that. I'm going to zip right through that part, and we're going to say in April, the United States declared war, and move again immediately into Alabama's experience here. Alabama National Guardsmen had returned to the state in February of 1917 from their Mexican Border Service, and they were actually gathered at the state encampment preparing to return to their civilian lives. But this, however, came just as Germany resumed their unrestricted submarine warfare, and then, of course, the Zimmerman Note was publicized. So demobilization orders were canceled and the men were kept on state active duty. The Alabama National Guard at this point numbered about 3,500 men. Some of those will remain at the headquarters camp in Montgomery, that was called Camp Sheridan, while the majority, and you can see from these figures, almost 3,000 of them spread across the state on guard duty that lasted several months. These men were assigned primarily to protect key transportation structures around the state. They received orders to be vigilant about suspicious activity and to enforce the laws against disloyalty or sedition. Once the U.S. declared war, throughout that spring of 1917, units of the Alabama National Guard were recalled to Camp Sheridan to prepare for further assignment and possible deployment overseas. And I'll just say here that almost all of these photographs that I'm using come from the state archives here. A few of them actually come from William Amarine's unit history, Alabama's Own in France, that Mitch had mentioned earlier in his presentation. Once they were back at Camp Sheridan, the men resumed what was now the familiar routine of camp life. Preparation for war was the primary objective, of course, and the men received instruction in all aspects of military requirements as well as specialized training targeted for the conditions of trench warfare on the Western Front. They also participated at various times in extended marches which allowed them to practice many aspects of their training. And these photographs I've used just to give you an indication of the conditions and the environment of Camp Sheridan. Most of these photographs will end up in a postcard type booklet that was really drawings of this, and they look much neater and cleaner. But these are the photographs. Of course, most orders and communications were directed toward the standard regulations of the military. But obviously, some orders were likely issued in direct response to certain activities or incidents. The public was interested and supportive of the troops at Camp Sheridan, and the city of Montgomery provided several opportunities for civilian and military interaction. And this is not related really to Alabama's troops here because they had already left Camp Sheridan at this time, but Camp Sheridan remained open as a camp for World War I, and that is how F. Scott Fitzgerald ends up in Montgomery, and we'll meet a young woman named Zelda because the public is providing these entertainment opportunities for the young men there. All right, back to Alabama, though, and at Camp Sheridan. All right, sanitation was a primary concern throughout this period. Bathhouses and kitchens were particularly cited as problem areas, and this is this time of the year in Alabama, in Montgomery. You can imagine, 3,000 plus men together in a relatively small area. All right, so this part of this slide right here shows cases of various diseases and illnesses that were treated by the medical teams in 5 months at Camp Sheridan. The measles cases were not newly contracted, but remained from border duty. Few of the malaria cases were certain diagnoses, but the initial symptoms suggested malaria, so the doctors treated them as such. Yet the sick rate at the camp was less than 1%. 2 deaths occurred from sickness contracted outside camp, but no deaths from illness contracted within the camp. And that really is a testament to how much they had learned about sanitation and improved practices from their time on the Mexican border. The Army wanted healthy soldiers, obviously. As one captain reminded his medical personnel in May 1917 that among the most important duties of medical officers was to return soldiers to duty as quickly as possible. And I think maybe you've already noticed the last entry. Venereal disease was almost always the major health concern. The one exception during this period, of course, will be later with the outbreak of flu. All right. The camp commander wrote that the major health detriment facing Alabama soldiers stemmed from the 2 evils, liquor and prostitution. In May, he circulated a memorandum concerning prostitution, liquor, venereal disease, and an Army's energy, noting that venereal disease was, quote, the greatest sap of the efficiency, end quote, of the armies in Europe. The brothels followed the saloons. Thus, as a military measure, the commander recommended prohibition first of the saloon and next of the brothel. So widespread was venereal disease that a separate ward was established to house those cases in the Montgomery camp. And this will remain a major concern even after the troops go overseas. The officers did make an effort in Montgomery to close the houses of prostitution. But you'll see here that one of the medical officers from Camp Sheridan said that there were enough prostitutes in town to serve a city of 400,000. And at this point, Montgomery's population was about 40,000. I just reported. I don't want to make it up, okay? On August 1st, 1917, sorry, I just now have gotten what all y'all are laughing at. Okay, all right. The War Department organized the 42nd, called the Rainbow Division, from National Guard units representing 27 states and the District of Columbia. In early August 1917, the Alabama National Guard, which was a total of 5,025 officers and men, was mustered into federal service at Camp Sheridan. The War Department chose the 4th Alabama Infantry Regiment to become the 167th Infantry, 84th Brigade, 42nd Division, which would be one of the first American divisions sent overseas. Many guardsmen from the other Alabama infantry and cavalry regiments joined the 4th, right, as the regiment recruited to war strength, bringing the total in the 4th Alabama to 3,677. Thus, the new 167th had the most experienced soldiers available in the state. Alabama supplied one of the 4 infantry regiments in the 42nd. The other 3 came from New York, Ohio, and Iowa. The commander of the regiment was Colonel William P. Screws, a former regular Army officer and now one of the major assets of the Alabama National Guard. His experience was probably the primary reason the 4th was selected to join the 42nd, because he did have regular Army experience. On August 15, 1917, the War Department officially designated the 4th Alabama Infantry as the 167th Infantry. And this photograph, this is found in William Amarine's book, this reflects the change, because you can see the photographs look almost exactly identical, except in the left one is the 4th flag, regimental flag, and on the right, and you can barely see 167th, and I think REG, that portion on the flag, that just denotes the change from the 4th to the 167th. On August 28th and 29th, the 167th entrained from Camp Sheridan in Montgomery for Camp Albert L. Mills in Garden City, Long Island, New York. And you can see on this slide a timetable of the 167th's movements that ended in November of that year, with the regiment in France prepared to participate in combat. And I don't know that this, I don't know what regiment this is, but this was one photograph I could find in the public domain that depicted Camp Mills.